discussion. Joining me today are two extremely eminent people to discuss what has been laid out for us. How does India get back to the high growth path, the challenges that it faces? Joining me on the panel, Mr. Shashi Tharoor, Senior Congress Leader and a member of India's Cabinet, India's Human Resource Development Minister. Also with me, India's iconic financial journalist, Ninan, Chairman of Business Standard. Thank you very much, both of you.
Good to be with
Mr. Ninan, before I go into what are the challenges, can we get some thoughts going on what we did which brought us to the current level? We were as a country growing at 8, 9%, and we are today struggling to grow in terms of even 5% or 6%. So before we go into what the challenges are, could you articulate what did we do to get ourselves into this position?
Vivek, thank you very much, and morning everybody. We've just seen the announcement this morning that industrial production in January was up 2.4%, and the headline said it beats expectations. Now, I never dreamt ever that we would have 2.4% industrial growth, which beat expectations, but that's where we are.
You guys have kept our expectations so low of late in the media.
But I do want to say that when we sometimes look at these dropping growth numbers, we tend to ignore the context. And the global context is that every country, virtually every country, has seen its growth rate drop by 3 to 4%. China was 12, it's 7.5. You can look at almost any country in the world and you will see a 3 to 4 percentage point drop in the growth rate from the pre-financial crisis days to now. So there is a global trend towards slower growth, and we have to recognize that as a fact and not say that this is something uniquely Indian. There is a problem, number one. Number two, of course, we've created our own problems to add to that. There has been inaction from the government. We should have had reform in the good years. We didn't. The government spent too much money and now it has to fall back. So there were domestic mistakes committed, and it is usual in good times to make mistakes. Mistakes are not just committed by government, mistakes are committed by companies. Most of your large companies have overinvested. They are steeped in debt. They're now trying to sell assets to write down their debt so that they have healthier balance sheets. And before that happens, you can't expect the companies to grow, and companies are the engine of growth. So it is not just government. Companies have made mistakes too. I don't know if that answers your question.
So are you saying, Mr. Ninan, that you agree when the government says that a large part of the problem was global factors? You tend to agree with that view?
A part of the problem. You can argue about how large or how small.
But what is your view?
Question.
Was it a large part?
It is a significant.
Or do you think we somewhere shot ourselves in the foot?
Exports and imports combined of goods and services account for something like 60% of your GDP. Not account for it, are equal to 60% of your GDP. Now, if you were doing 25% export growth and the markets in the West are declining, in all the large markets except for China are declining, exports are down to nothing. The latest figures are 4% growth, before that was minus. You lose that kind of momentum on your international trade, you think there's going to be no setback on your domestic production? It will have a setback. So it is an important component of the slowdown. It's not the only component, it may not even be the primary component, but it is an important fact.
Mr. Tharoor, perhaps the most read word in Indian media all of last 2 years was the word policy paralysis.
No.
And today we've started using the word green shoots a lot. What is your own sense? And just to answer the question which I posed to Mr. Ninan, what did we do to get ourselves into this position? Do you also agree with what he says, that it's largely to do with...
No, he thinks the media is to blame.
Oh, certainly. I think that there's no question that the doom and gloom was as exaggerated as the earlier boosterism was also perhaps a bit overhyped. You know, we managed to persuade ourselves. I mean, there's this terrible old caution that's given to young politicians. Never believe your own press releases. And I think at some point in the first decade of the 21st century, we all began believing our own press releases. And we were convincing ourselves that we were destined to irresistibly grow by an increasing percentage each year until somewhere around 2020 we'd sort of burst forth into sort of developed country status. And that was always, I think, exaggerated. But then when it turned out not to be possible, and when our ability very effectively to resist global trends and to initially weather the first year of the global financial crisis rather well, when that could not be sustained and we began showing some of the inevitable knock-on effects of the global economy, then suddenly, I think, my dear friend Ninan's tribe went too far the other way. Yes, you talked about policy paralysis, you talked about various negative trends. Of course, they were for reasons not to do with the government particularly, but with the working effectively of our democratic institutions. There was a whole to do about corruption, which naturally also began to make investors skittish. And all of this combined, I think, to put us in a far worse place than we objectively needed to be. Were there certain things the government did which it might have done differently? I'm sure. I'm not holding an economic portfolio in the government, and it's not appropriate for me to comment on the work of colleagues. But I think the new finance minister, I mean, he's an old finance minister who's new again, has certainly taken some steps that have marked a bit of a departure from his predecessor, have held certain actions in abeyance, and have, as you know, he has tried to articulate a new approach in the budget, which many people feel has sent the right signals out to the global and the domestic investment community. Where do we go from here? I mean, the green shoots of hope as well as the green shoots of growth will have to be seen. And the great focus on numbers, whether it's going to be 6 or 5, as people say, and whether that's bad news or good news, 5 in relation to 7 in China or 7.5 in China is actually not bad compared to where we were at our best by comparison with where China was at that time. But I think we need to do better. And our government seems very confident, our finance minister is very confident, that we'll be looking at a number like 7 again by this time next year. Let me stress that there are a number of things we need to do right, but some of it is tangible, actual policies. Some of it is less tangible, creation of confidence in the system. And some of it, frankly, is the vagaries of our politics, which unfortunately will get complicated over the next year with an election looming by April, roughly, of 2014 at the latest. So with that happening, for example, one thing that I often hear from the captains of industry in India is what a no-brainer it is to adopt the GST, the new goods and services tax that has been debated threadbare for the last couple of years. The general consensus is that just adopting such a tax and thereby removing the various uneven and contradictory taxes it would replace would actually give us a direct boost to GDP. Some even speak of a 2% gain in GDP just from that one decision alone. Well, is it that we don't have the brains to adopt it? No, it's because we have a federal system in which opposition ruled states, in the present climate of politics as a zero-sum game, are simply refusing to go along with it. And we cannot adopt it without them. So these are some of the challenges we're facing, and a combination of all of these, I think, rather than any particular malfeasance or bad faith on the part of the government, has brought us to the pass we're in, and I'm still confident we will be able to turn things around. Certainly we should do better in the next fiscal year than in the current one.
Mr. Ninan, few people have tracked this old finance minister, now new finance minister, closer than you have. What did you make out of this budget? It was meant to be like a roadmap in terms of, from here on, where are we going to go till 2014? Did he leave you satisfied?
I think the most important thing is that he didn't put a foot wrong. He didn't go and commit a blunder because that would have sent off negative shockwaves again. We're still paying the price for some of the stuff that was there in last year's budget, and it's still not been resolved. But I think international business is more negative on India in many ways now than it's ever been. And these are problems that we've created. So that's one step, that he didn't do something that would cause a fresh problem of any kind. The second issue, I think, really was that we had to make sure that we averted rating downgrade, which was a real problem, I think, a prospect in the middle of 2012. And so there had to be evidence of credible fiscal correction, which he showed. and it wasn't easy. It meant squeezing expenditure like it's never been done before, but he did it. So there is some credibility restored to the fiscal process, which has been missing for the last 2-3 years. And if we then believe that we will stay the course on this new course, then that adds to the credibility of the government's functioning and its fiscal management. So those, I think, are the two most important issues. Frankly, the rest of it is matters of detail.
Mr. Ninan, when one talks to stock market gurus, there seems to be a view coming from them which is fairly euphoric, in the sense this year sometime...
Euphoric?
Yes. Sometime this year we are going to take out all-time highs. We've seen a fairly decent run in our market even last year, even though the economy was floundering. We've seen FII money continuing to pour in. There seems to be a sense there that we will this year take out all-time highs. But when you talk to corporate India, it's totally the reverse. There is still a sense of saying, look, the investment cycle remains dead. We are not seeing any green shoots in that sense. Do you think, again, we are somewhere going into an exaggeration mode where we are already too early saying green shoots have happened and we are back on track?
You should be careful about players on the stock market who want to talk up the market and get poor investors to put their money in and become saps. So I would be very wary of stock market gurus, so to speak, talking up a market. I would say, what's your interest in it? As for the real economy, I think you have to be very careful not to be too optimistic. We have serious macroeconomic issues. We are off balance in a way that almost no major economy is. We have among the highest fiscal deficits. We have among the highest current account deficits. And you have among the highest inflation rates. Those are like your pulse rate, your temperature, and your blood pressure, and all three are flashing red. So you need to get your macroeconomic system in balance before you can talk about rapid growth. And to believe that you can get rapid growth tomorrow will actually mean a macroeconomic crisis. So I don't understand this talk about getting back to 8% in short order. It's not going to happen. It'll take time.
Mr. Tharoor, just this morning we had no less than the World Bank president here in India saying that India needs to invest in human capital if it needs to get back to the growth path that it aspires to be. It's not something that you normally talk much about. We talk more about the fisc or the CAD, etc. Is there a vision that you have in place as the government?
Absolutely.
To invest in human capital? Because increasingly, we hear corporates saying the problem which we face is lack of skills.
Totally.
And that sounds very dichotomous because all along we believed that we have this whole demographic dividend, intellectual capital, intelligent people, and today people are just questioning that.
It's absolutely clear that this is a key issue. And in fact, if you look at the demographic dividend numbers, they really are quite striking. I won't bore you with too many of them, but the fact is there are 560 million people in this country under the age of 25. And if you just take the kids from 10 to 19, that's 225 million. Which means that for the next 20, 30, maybe 40 years, we'll have a dynamic, productive, working age population at a time when the rest of the world, including China, is aging. Right? In less than a decade's time, the average age in Europe is going to be 40 plus. In the US is going to be 40, in Europe it's going to be 46. In Japan 47, in China 49 or even close to 50. And we are going to be still chippily along at 29. The ILO has estimated that as early as 2020 we will have a much larger workforce age between 20 and 24 than China. Our figure will be 116 million according to the ILO. China's will be 94 million. So we suddenly have this extraordinary numbers game where, in a sense, instead of the old cliche, nothing succeeds like success, here it's a case of nothing succeeding like failure. Our failure to have an effective population control program, as was urged on us by so many abroad, has actually given us potentially a tremendous, tremendous dividend. But this will only work as a dividend if we can get the education and training part right. There is no question that the fundamental obligation we have is to ensure that we offer education to people, that those who don't necessarily need or can benefit from a conventional education can get into vocational training. And both are major challenges. On the education front, it's often forgotten that the British left us in 1947 with a 16% literacy rate, 17 in the census of 1951 after the British left. And we have had to bring it up. Now it's 74, which still isn't good enough. But at the same time, that expansion has been absolutely massive. So you've gone from 30 universities to 670 universities. You've gone from 700 colleges to 35,000 colleges. You really have had to undertake, and I can't even give you the numbers of schools that have had to be built since 1947. Expansion has been important, and in a complicated place like ours, the second E that we've had to think about is equity. We had to include the excluded. There were lots of people left out of the educational system in India because of problems related to birth. I mean, gender, caste, religion, region. And they've all had to be incorporated as well. In the process, I think we have insufficiently paid attention to the third E, which is excellence. Quality has been uneven. You've got some excellent elite institutions, the IITs, others of that ilk, St. Stephen's College, if I could put a plug for my alma mater. But at the end of the day, once you get past these islands of excellence, they're floating on a sea of mediocrity. And you're quite right that a large percentage of our employers state that when they hire graduates, even from this proliferation of engineering institutions we produced in the last decade or two, that essentially most of them need remedial education. And I don't mean on-the-job training. You always train the people you hire. These are companies that are essentially putting kids back into college for a year, or 6 months or 9 months at the very least, to make up for the deficiencies of what they've learned in their universities.
So what are you doing about it?
Infosys has a campus in Mysore, for example, to do that. Finally, just to give you the diagnosis, and I'll give you the prescription very briefly. And finally, so you've got all of this when it comes to the shortage of skill talent. And finally, you've got the vocational piece of the puzzle. Country of 1.2 billion people, we have a nationwide shortage of masons. We don't have enough qualified and certified plumbers, carpenters, auto mechanics. Why? Because for 3,000 years in our culture, if you wanted to be a carpenter or a cobbler, well, you better have a dad or an uncle who was a carpenter or a cobbler, because that's how knowledge is transmitted. It comes down the gene pool. And so there isn't a tradition of widespread accessibility for vocational education. Now, this is the diagnosis. What have we done about it? What are we continuing to do? Because it's early days yet. I mean, I've added a fourth E to this theory,
which is?
By employability. I'd like to produce people who are employable. Now, as far as the quality institutions are concerned, we're trying to get them more autonomy. We're trying to get bills through our rather dysfunctional legislative system in Parliament in order to ensure that more autonomous institutions, universities for research and innovation and so on are created. Foreign education providers allowed to come in, all of these other things. So the quality institutions are doing well. We hope they can do better. They can be freed to do better. For the rest, mandatory accreditation, ensuring certain quality standards, trying to make sure that we can get institutions of a certain quality out there, and if necessary, that we can rigorously tackle and close the ones that aren't up to any good. Ensuring right through that we get a better and a larger quantity, a cohort coming out of the school system into colleges. Right now we have a tremendous success in primary enrollment. In fact, we're doing so well that the so-called gross enrollment ratio, which is a very technical term in education, it is the enrollment, the percentage of enrollment in relation to the estimated size of the population of that age bracket. At the primary school level, our gross enrollment ratio is 111%. We've put in more kids into the school system than we thought existed. But we're not able to keep them there. By class 8, they're dropping out in significant numbers. The GER drops to 69%. By class 11 and 12, the school leaving years, it's as low as 39%. So if we don't keep them there, what happens to these people? Do they become a drag on the economy? They're unproductive members of the economy? That becomes a serious issue. Vocational training. We're now trying to get vocational instruction into the high schools. Once you've lost the kids from the high schools, you may not be able to catch them in the vocational net. Offer them exposure early on. There's a pilot project. The Prime Minister has appointed the former head of TCS as his own advisor on skill development. And we've now got pilot projects in 4 states. 360 hours of vocational training at the high school level. Right? So we're trying to do everything we can to ensure that the options are available for a decent education, incentive to stay in school, and I can give you examples of the many, many incentives from midday meals to bank deposits for girl students, all sorts of things to try and keep kids in school. Then improving quality at college level and offering vocational training for those who can't go. If we can manage to fulfill this vision effectively, and in India we always know that implementation is 3/4 of the problem. If we can get all of this done, we will in fact reap a huge demographic dividend.
And what's the time frame for this?
Well,
you've set for yourself?
I mean, it's immediate and ongoing. I don't want to put a sort of end of the road number for it because it's an ongoing challenge. Each time we do enough for the people we've got to look after today, there are more born tomorrow. So I would say if we get systems in place, in the shelf life of this parliament, which is just another year, all we can do is begin to lay the platform, and we're doing that. If we can get systems in place over the next decade, I think we'll be very, very, very well off.
Mr. Ninan, the other big issue which is always flagged off is infrastructure. Is that somewhere, do you think, we're even getting ahead? In a recent parliamentary reply, the ministry concerned said 270 projects delayed. The cost overrun is equal to the original cost. And more than 50-odd projects, more than 3 years delayed. We've had all this, cabinet committee on investments being set up, et cetera, et cetera. But do you think the government is doing enough to kickstart that whole process and fix the problem?
Vivek, the infrastructure problem is, again, as I see it, a story of the facts being much better in terms of rate of improvement than we recognize, and yet the reality, of course, being much worse than what it should be. But let me just address the first point out of these two, which is that you've taken up investment in infrastructure as a percentage of GDP from somewhere about 3% 5 or 6 years ago to 6% plus, heading towards 8 or 9%. That is a fairly dramatic change, the amount of money that's going into investment, into infrastructure, and you can see it all around you. You can see it in the roads, you can see it in the airports, you can see it in the power stations. You take electricity, generally recognized as a disaster story. But the fact is that in 3 years, we would add more capacity than we did in the previous 10. And if we did not have the unexpected problem of a gas shortage as fuel in the south, and the coal import problem suddenly becoming an issue because of prices, and therefore some 30,000 megawatts of power capacity lying idle. If you did not have that fuel problem, actually you would have had, for the first time, barely any shortage at all in power supply across the country.
But the distribution still remains a challenge.
There are lots of issues, but I'm saying that in comparison with the past, you have moved so far ahead in terms of, you used to do 5,000 megawatts of capacity in a year, now you're doing 20,000. That's changed. So it is much better than before, but obviously there is a shortage of everything that you need to do, and one of the characteristics of the Indian economy remains inadequate and poor physical infrastructure. There are policy issues, there are financing issues, there are player issues. Your entire public-private partnership program has run into problems because the private sector parties have gotten into financial trouble. Things haven't worked out the way they should, and so there are policy issues to be resolved. But it's the old story that as a static picture, you can see a mess, but as a moving picture, you see substantial improvement.
Mr. Tharoor, one of the biggest developments that we saw in the last couple of years was that the policy makers just didn't want to take a decision. The bureaucracy was too scared to even lift its pen. There was this whole fear psychosis that what if I do something, some agency, some court is going to pull me up 10 years down the line. Do you think somewhere that was exaggerated, overdone, and the implications of that or the repercussions of that were probably far worse than we thought? And do you see signs of that confidence coming back to take decisions?
Slowly. I mean, the fact is that, we had this huge mass hysteria about corruption. And corruption deserves to be condemned and deserves to be acted resolutely against. But it became sort of the be-all and end-all of public discourse. Number one story in the media, all the headlines, all the breaking news stories, and of course the very rigorous provisions of the proposed Lokpal bill and so on. And suddenly, yes, it's true, there were government officials saying, I can't be punished for things I don't do, therefore don't do anything. Which is, of course, the worst thing in a country that needs effective action. You have other issues where ministers are taking decisions, overruling the advice of their bureaucrats. And in the old days, the bureaucrats went along with it, recognizing the minister's prerogative. Now, if it turns out that the minister's motives are going to be suspect, the bureaucrat wants to put a note on the file, covering his own behind. That kind of phenomenon has been happening much more. And of course, in some cases, bureaucrats appear to have had to face charges in recent years for no fault of their own or for having gone along with the decisions of their political masters, which may have been made for improper motives. Now, all of these definitely have a negative effect on the decision-making system. Having said that, government has to function. Decisions have to be made. And after a while, especially once the media hysteria, the public hysteria has calmed down, by and large, people get on with the business of government. There's still some lingering hesitations, I'm sure. And in my ministry, we're talking about matters which very rarely have the kind of headline-grabbing attention. I mean, how much can go wrong in serving midday meals to 150 million kids, which we're doing every day? Because after all, that's the worst kind of big-ticket expenditure issue that can create such a scandal. When you look at it, the challenges faced by some of the ministries that are deciding on key issues as to what you can import, whether to import, how much you pay for what you import, those ministries are the ones where there's perhaps more caution involved in decision making, because everyone is anxious not only to be clean, but to be seen to be clean. That can slow things down. At the end of the day, it'll be a wash, I'm fairly sure.
Mr. Ninan, if you were to suggest 3 things that this government should do from here on to bring India back to that 8 to 9%, what would it be?
Oh, if it was that easy, I'd be Prime Minister.
Or at least Finance Minister.
What are the 3 things? I think step number 1, I've already suggested, is to focus primarily on restoring macroeconomic balance. It is dangerous to have this level of imbalance in your key macroeconomic variables when the world is an uncertain place and you don't know when the next shock might come. And if you're off balance and then a shock hits you, you just keel over. So you need to be firmly planted on 2 feet. And your economy therefore has to be in balance. You have to address the current account deficit. You have to address the fiscal deficit, and you have to bring inflation down. That's the single most important thing. The second issue which I would like to get into is an issue which comes through indirectly in some of what Shashi's been saying, which is that you have a fundamental problem with the quality of governance and the capacity of the state to deliver. It doesn't deliver projects on time. I'm sorry to say so, but it has a problem delivering quality education. People are voting with their wallets to go to the private sector schools and colleges and now universities. There is a problem with the quality of governance in law and order, in the judiciary and delivering justice on time. On almost any front, you can see a problem of governance. You have to improve the capacity of the state to deliver. This is not an easy switch something on or change a policy and it happens. It's hard work and it will take time. But there is no successful state which is so weak in governance that it can't deliver the basics. So I think those are 2 big issues.
But do you believe, Mr. Ninan, that's something we're going to have to live with as a country? Because in terms of
no, you should not accept it.
In terms of good people, this government probably has had, extremely eminent, sensible people, clean people. But is it something that we're just going to have to live with? Because
no, it's
there
not
is the whole coalition politics
issue. This thesis that India grows at night when the government is asleep is rubbish. You need a government. A successful country needs a proper government. There is no successful country which does not have a proper government. You need that. And there's no reason why you have to accept the position where you don't.
You agree with that?
I agree totally. In fact, this is something which is almost a cliche, but what we have to do is to use the government to get both the hardware of development right and the software right. The hardware, the ports, the airports, the roads, the railway networks. Nobody else can do this better than a government. It can enlist the private sector to come in and do the actual investing and bidding and constructing and operating. That's another matter. But the government has to give the lead, has to make the plans, has to, in a country like ours.
That is when to sleep.
No, I wouldn't say it's gone to sleep. I just think we haven't done it well enough or fast enough by comparison with where we could have been. Second, on the software of development, the human capital issues we're talking about. Education, obviously, number 1. Healthcare is another one. It's a shame that 65 years after independence, there are still tens of millions of our people who don't have access to a primary health center within 5 kilometers of their place of residence. We need to do that. Sanitation. It's still a crying shame that in so many places our sanitation systems are near collapse. So these basic things, Ninan is right, the government has to deliver. Thereafter, we should get out of some of the things that it's trying to control unnecessarily and let the private sector feel the confidence to invest and act. As you correctly remarked, Vivek, early on in our conversation, many in the private sector have been reluctant to invest. And indeed, many are
they're investing abroad.
Looking abroad to invest surpluses that could really be usefully absorbed here. One meets them when one goes abroad. So the question is, what do we do to give them the encouragement and the motive that says, stay here because we actually offer better returns over a longer term and with a growing market of people who are now getting more and more confident and affluent into the middle class and above than any other country pretty much that's available to you as an investor. The same argument we make to foreign investors to bring them here, we now need to make to our domestic capitalists. And I think to do all that, we need a strong and credible government, and that's what we're trying to provide.
And frankly, that will bring out the third item, if I may just close. You asked for three, so let me give you the third, which flows from what Shashi said, that the fact is that you score very poorly on the World Bank's ranking of countries in terms of
ease of doing business. Yeah, we're very low.
186th on some issues, 130th on some issues. You really should be putting three of your most capable young ministers together into a team and saying, listen guys, take each one of the things on which you score poorly, break them down into specific tasks, go after them. I want an improvement of 10 ranks every year. Make the country an easier place in which to do business.
Agreed.
Mr. Ninan, in many ways it's said that today the percentage of financial savings is lower than what it was back in the early 90s when the reform was there. So while the country's grown, infrastructure's grown, a lot of things have grown, in many ways the household savings coming into the financial market are still pretty much where they were. And financial illiteracy is not a rural issue, it's an urban issue as well. And in many ways is the reason why we are still perhaps worse off than when we were in 91, 92. Do you think that is something that has not been addressed? If you see our markets, they're just as deep or as shallow as they were even back then. Take away the FIIs, I'd say.
I don't know which savings you're talking about, but if you take macro household savings.
I'm talking about into the financial markets. Savings into the financial
savings by households is much higher today than in the 90s. There's no question. Okay. I don't have the figure at the top of my head, but there's no question financial savings by households are much higher today.
I think as an overall percentage, they seem to have dropped.
Fallen from the peak of 2007-8, but that is understandable because the economy slowed down. So if your reference point is to 07-08, yes, it's fallen. But in comparison to at any point of the 90s, it is much higher.
And it's probably still the highest household savings rate in Asia.
I was talking about household savings moving into financial markets.
Now, your problem or your focus is stock markets. And the fact is retail households don't trust your stock markets. And if they go to mutual funds, the mutual funds deliver less than what the market delivers. So the fund managers are not very good. Why should they trust you? So the primary form of saving for most households, even today, are the banks. They may not give you the best returns, so they turn to gold. Because inflation rates are high, the bank deposit rates are lower than the inflation rate, you're getting a negative real rate of interest, they put the money in gold. Are they irrational? No, they're being perfectly rational. They're responding to your financial sector signals. I mean, you look at the price of gold today compared to 5 years ago, you look at your stock market index compared to 5 years ago, where is your stock market? Nowhere. Where is gold? It's trebled. Why would they not invest in gold or real estate? They're perfectly rational human beings. Give them a proper market, they'll invest in the market.
You don't believe financial illiteracy is a problem in India?
Sorry?
You don't believe financial illiteracy is a problem in India?
I think they're very literate. They're doing the right thing.
Now, I think I will dissent a little bit from Ninan on this. There is no question that one of our great strengths, surely, is that we have a financial system that is able to hold its own with the world. We have the oldest stock market in Asia.
We built the infrastructure.
We built the infrastructure. We have even weathered a terrorist attack on the Bombay Stock Exchange, for God's sake, and they were up and running the next day. And we know how to operate systems in the sophisticated financial environment of the 21st century. What we haven't done is get the message out to the general public to the same extent as you have in other societies. So investing in the stock market is still a very, very minority preoccupation.
Absolutely. Yeah.
There's a very tiny elite, or not necessarily elite, a tiny segment within the middle class that's actually habitually investing. It may partially be for the reasons Ninan mentioned. I think it's partially quite simply ignorance of the available opportunities. There was an expectation some years ago that if the spread through, if a culture investing in the stock market spread through, that obviously the index would just keep shooting up indefinitely because there'd be more and more investors and values of companies that go up and so on. That hasn't happened. This sort of, every time you have some sort of scandal, like the Harshad Mehta scandal in the early 90s or whatever, then all sorts of middle class people say, oh my God, I'd rather just leave my money in a bank. At least no one can play with it this way. And so that amount of caution comes in. And whether financial literacy is the word, that's perhaps a little unkind to suggest that people are illiterate. A lot more needs to be done, including perhaps by the government, to encourage people to invest in the stock market and to give them the sense that in so doing, they are investing in the future development of India. People don't see that correlation right now. They see it as a sophisticated form of gambling. And I think until that cultural attitude changes, I don't think it's right to blame the financial system as such, because I actually think that our financial system is one of the more impressive in the emerging market economies in the world.
Okay, I'm going to throw the floor open to some questions. Please identify yourself, and if it is specific to either of the two panelists, then mention it or leave it to me to toss it over. First question. Yes, sir. Please go ahead. Can we get a mic here?
Tell us who they are as well. It's so dark, we can hardly see.
Yeah, some lights on.
Vikram Badshah. Sir, this is to the Honorable Minister. You talked about vocational training. There's a large percentage of young people in this country who are not academically inclined. Keeping them in school is a challenge, but getting them to be vocationally trained and then employed is another challenge. How much of that can we align with the Western world with? A lot of countries abroad allow people of that kind of background a very good future. What are the steps we're taking to do that in our country now?
It's still incipient, Vikram. We've got, as I said, the Prime Minister's new advisor on skills development, Mr. Ramadurai. The National Skills Development Council is about to be transformed into a skills development authority, though the process is still going on. So at the top level, they're creating structures to actually lead this. In terms of detail, as I mentioned, we are trying to get some vocational instruction into the high schools. It's still experimental, pilot project in 4 states, but it's working very well so far, and we hope to expand it throughout the country. What we also need to do is, frankly, get the private sector to do much more of vocational training than it is doing right now. One thing I didn't mention in the earlier conversation that we are doing with the universities is trying to promote more industry-university collaboration. We're trying to actually encourage much more interface between industry and the academic world for research purposes. In the polytechnics, we're going to try and get actual apprenticeships, as it were, built into the system. And similarly, if in the vocational level, you can actually have industry telling us, this is the kind of basic skill we need for a lathe operator or a mechanic of some sort. I don't know. There are disciplines that I'm not even familiar with in which people are not being adequately trained. We can convert either existing institutions like the ITIs or help create new institutions that will train these people. Don't forget, a lack of trainers is also a big challenge for us. I wasn't entirely joking when I said that if you want to be a carpenter or a cobbler, you better have a father or an uncle who is one. Where do you get a carpenter who's going to be giving up his carpentry shop or the cobbler sitting under the tree to get up and go and teach a bunch of strangers how to do carpentry or cobbling? The honest truth is that we need to create structures that make that possible. So for the needs of industry, you can send us some of your people. Send a foreman, give him 3 days off to come and instruct young people in a new vocational training institution to actually come and acquire the skills that that particular industry can use. So we would actually have a direct shortcut into employment through that kind of vocational training. It would be a powerful incentive for otherwise unwilling young people.
Is allowing foreign universities to come into India on your table?
Very much on my table and on the government's table, but frankly, it's looking difficult in Parliament. It actually was introduced as a bill in 2010. It has worked its way through the Parliamentary Standing Committee. There have been a number of reservations expressed. There seems to be some reluctance in that process of bargaining by which bills are actually brought to the floor for debate and passage, it has so far not been able to move towards the head of the queue. I'm not going to give you irresponsible speculation as to why there is resistance, but I think it's no secret that some of the pending bills of our ministry, and this goes back before my time, so I have no personal stake in it, some of the bills have met with a significant amount of political resistance, and not only from the opposition parties. So it doesn't help also, of course, that Parliament has been made so dysfunctional by the opposition parties, which have chosen to believe that disruption is preferable to debate, that in any case, the quantum of bills getting through our system has dramatically reduced. So, for example, the last session, 25 bills were slated for passage, 3 got voted through, because so many days were lost to disruption. This is and remains a chronic worry in our system. We lost 3 days last week. Today, I was actually in danger of cancelling on all of you, because if all had gone well, there might have been a debate and vote on the railway budget between 12 and 1. But the House was disrupted. It rose till 12. I said, I don't trust these people. I'm going to head to keep my original commitment. Call me if they actually meet. And sure enough, I got a call as I was arriving. I said they're now adjourned till 2. So this kind of disruption that we are now seeing in our Parliament, I'm afraid, is a real problem when it comes to creating a meaningful and effective legislative framework for the kind of changes we want to make. So we're doing as much as we can that doesn't require new laws. But anything requiring new laws, I'm afraid, is taking more time than it should.
Yes, the gentleman there.
Hi, Gaurav Rekhi, Bain & Company. One of the interesting aspects that we discussed among the two of you was private education and how people are voting with their wallets. And just how does the minister think about, the role of government in primary and secondary education, and how, it's being almost proven scientifically by numbers that this voting with the wallet is happening, and how do you see this evolving over time?
My worry about it is actually not that it's happening. I went to a missionary school, a pair of missionary schools myself. It's more that, unfortunately, some people with very little in their wallets, who are skimping and saving from menial jobs and so on, are spending that money to send their children to dodgy private schools, where they're actually going to get a standard of education inferior to what they would have got in a government school, because somehow they managed to persuade themselves that it would be better. So we have a serious PR problem, to put it mildly, but it's more than that. We are in the danger of actually producing kids who've been to school but who don't actually have the kind of learning they should have had for the effort their parents have made, the sacrifices their parents have made. We need to improve standards across the board. As far as the government schools are concerned, what they've got is infrastructure. What they don't have enough of is quality teaching and the kinds of conditions that are necessarily conducive to a learning environment. It's not uncommon to find 80 kids in a classroom. 80. I mean, it's not the official norm, it's not the way it should be, but if you don't have enough teachers who've come into the government school system, it'll happen this way. We're trying to improve all of this across the board, by the way, and there are now teacher eligibility tests, there are new teacher training mechanisms, we've made compulsory in-service training, all sorts of things to try and make for a better educational outcome in the government school system. But I'm not going to pretend that it's perfect. My argument is we have to improve the government schools, but we have no problem with there being good quality private schools as well. It's the good quality part that we need to pay attention to. And there again, we do need to have a system which actually doesn't rely entirely on the market. So for people, because unfortunately there is a level of ignorance. That means that people can actually make bad choices with the best of intentions. We need to create the kind of quality that will give everybody opportunity. One of the objectives of the Right to Education Act, for the foreigners in this room, India passed a constitutional amendment in 2009 that actually guarantees as a constitutional right 8 years of free schooling from age 6 to 14 for every child in India. And it's working in terms of getting kids into school. It obliges all schools, including private schools, except minority institutions, that's a Supreme Court judgment. It mandates them to take 25% students from the economically disadvantaged sections of society, and the government will reimburse the private schools for those 25 students on the basis of an average fee to be worked out in consultation between the government and the school. But as a result, the poor actually can get into very good schools. Now, the challenge is for them to be able to keep up with what's being taught in those schools, but the opportunities are there, and some are doing well. I've heard some heartwarming stories of some kids, children of domestic servants and so on, who've transformed their opportunities in good schools. So it's a mammoth task, but we are trying to get some of it right.
All right, I'm going to take one final question. Yes, the lady here.
I'm Tabassum Jamal from CSIR, and my question is a follow-up in the context of skilling and employability. As the minister rightly told the significance, my question is that, when we talk about the skilling initiatives, and a lot of things are happening, in National Skill Development Mission, in 11th plan and 12th plan as well. And the employability and skilling, that means the certification mechanism is the key point, which I think we are not talking much about. And the very recently proposed framework that is called National Vocational Education Qualification Framework, which has been, I think, under the argument or the debate in Planning Commission. I would like to request Minister to just reflect some points on that, whether we are going to have the implementation right away, or is it some wait for that? Thank you.
It'll happen, but there's still a bit of, there is a complication. And are we on the record here? I suppose we are with all those cameras around, so I'm going to have to choose my words a bit carefully. My ministry has come up with a national vocational qualification educational framework. That's the job of the Human Resource Development Ministry. The Labour Ministry has also come up with a slightly different set of vocational qualifications that the Labour Ministry administers. And the Labour Ministry has some vocational training centres, as you know, the ITIs and so on. The National Skill Development Council has got into the Act and is now trying to reconcile both of these. The National Skill Development Council, under the Planning Commission, is now creating something called a National Skills Qualification Framework. That will, we hope, in an ideal world, merge the best of the other two, combine them both, and give us one product that can be applied nationwide. We aren't there yet, but these slight complications are being ironed out. It is a matter of priority. It should happen, shall we say, sooner rather than later, but please don't ask me to put a date on it. That's as far as I'm prepared to go right now. No. We're going ahead with skilling initiatives. We're going ahead with vocational training and so on. The framework simply lays out what qualifications will entitle you to what certificate, which will be recognized for what job, and that kind of thing. That's the process that needs to be evened out. But training kids, getting them into the system, all that will go. And frankly, I would like to see much more of a pickup on this by the private sector. I'm surprised that some of our private sector behemoths have not created a more significant vocational training apparatus. First of all, they need more qualified people, and they live in a society that needs more plumbers and electricians and mechanics and so on. Why shouldn't they see this as a worthwhile area to go into? If the answer is that they don't see a large enough population willing to pay affordable enough fees to make it a viable business venture for them, then all I can say is shame to them. This is something really worth doing in their larger interest, and perhaps could be a better use of their CSR funds and many things they're spending them on.
Bad idea.
Bad idea. All right.
All right, we've run out of time. Thank you very much, Mr. Tharoor, Mr. Ninan, for joining us here on the session. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.